1,000 pixels. So now our article will expand at 90% of the viewport until it hits 1,000 pixels, and then it will stop expanding. If we go back to our page and refresh here, you can see our article has now been contained to only being 1,000 pixels in total width. Our line lengths are looking okay. And if we kept making our viewport even bigger, only the space on the left and right will get bigger, but the text will always stay at this width of 1,000 pixels. So I think we have our example page in pretty good shape for readability now. The exact number of media queries or type tweak points that we need to add, and exactly at what ranges we need to add them at, will depend greatly on your specific layouts and content. And of course, you may find other points that need tweaking as you go to test these pages on actual devices and in real contexts, not just a browser-based resizing tool. This gets us off to a great start and lets us change a number of things quickly, but it's not the only way we should be testing these things. Sometimes you may only need 1 or 2 media queries to adjust your type, like we did here, and other times you may find yourself needing a few more. The important part is to keep an eye out for the points at which your type may need a little extra adjustment, and to always pick some point at which your container has reached an upper limit for its width. At some point, things have to stop expanding infinitely. Headlines can be an especially sticky point in typography for responsive design. The designer in us wants exact pixel-perfect control over where these important line breaks happen and when, but responsive design is more about giving up that kind of detailed control, and that can be really tough to deal with. In this tutorial, we'll look at a technique you can use to control the line breaks of an important heading with a little bit of markup and some media queries. A word of warning though, this is something to use sparingly and only when necessary. If you did this for every single headline on your site, you would drive yourself crazy. But it's a good trick to use in those few cases where you really do need to be a little extra picky. To demonstrate this, we'll use our headline in isolation like you see here. We've also changed it a bit to be set all in one font and all in the same container. As we take a look at our headline at various viewport widths, you'll notice that the line breaks pretty much arbitrarily, basically however it's actually going to fit within the viewport. That's normal, and generally what we have to expect in responsive design. Sometimes the second line is only one word long, and sometimes it'll break in a logical place, but sometimes it won't. The typographer in us is definitely annoyed by this lack of control. Luckily, we can gain just a little more control over this when it's absolutely necessary, using some span tags. Let's head to Coda and look at our HTML and put some spans where our line breaks might seem the most logical. So I'll look at our index.html page, and this is our headline right here. The most logical way for this particular headline to break is to actually have the breakfast drama on one line, and then that rocked the world as a second line. So let's add spans around each of those lines. Now we have our span tags indicating what should be the first and second line in the case when this headline needs to break into 2 lines. And let's give each of them a class so we can target them in our CSS. We'll give them each a class of responsive design line, or RDW line. And we'll add this to our second span as well. If we save our HTML and preview this in our browser now, absolutely nothing has changed, because by default, our span elements are inline elements, and we've done nothing to change that. But now that we have these hooks in place, we can add some additional CSS to force a line break where we want it. So let's head back to Coda and look at our CSS. First, we'll add a rule to have these RWD line spans display as block elements by default. And we'll add these here right under our H1 since that's where those spans are. So we'll add a rule for the RWD line class and set that to display block. Previewing this now, we'll see that it works, and by making those spans block, we have forced the line break to happen right where we want it to. This works pretty well at medium-sized viewports, and even I guess really large ones, but it does break down a bit at smaller viewport widths, so we have to do just a little bit more than this. I'd like to have the headline all in one line when it fits in larger widths, and we should remove our forced line break when the viewport is so narrow that the headline needs to split into more than 2 lines. So let's add media queries to handle those cases. It looks like our title had the space to display all in one line at viewport widths greater than 1,000 pixels. So let's set a media query to display our spans in line above that size. And now we'll add a rule for our RWD line spans. And now at viewport widths at 1,000 pixels or higher, we will overwrite that display block with a display inline. If we want to check that this works, we can save it and go back to our browser, refresh our page, and you can see we are over 1,000 pixels in viewport width. And now our headline is all on one line. And if we go below 1,000, we'll see it breaks where we want it to. Now we just need to add a media query to take care of removing our line break on narrower viewport widths. So back to our CSS, we'll add one more media query. It looked like our headline started breaking into more than 2 lines, around 500 pixels in width. So we'll use that as a setting for our next media query. And we'll make this media query a max width media query, because we only want it to take place below and at 500 pixels, not above. And here we'll add a rule for our class that sets our display to be inline again, which essentially renders our spans kind of invisible because they'll be inline just like the text was already inline, and it will break wherever it needs to once the viewport is that narrow. We can save this and check back on our browser again just to verify that yes, now we're below 500 pixels and our forced line breaks are no longer there. And it's looking a little better when the headline needs to break into more than 2 lines. If you've been thinking ahead a little, you've probably realized that what we've done so far is really only part of the work. To use this technique in production, we'd need to test our line break related media queries on various devices and other browsers to make sure we were getting the line break where we wanted it. Subtle differences in browsers and how they render and display our type can affect line breaks like this. That's certainly far too much trouble to go through for every headline on your site, but it's a handy technique to keep in mind for special cases. Like many designers, I absolutely love web fonts, but there's one thing about web fonts that remains just a bit ugly, and that is the flash of unstyled text, or FOUT, that we often see before our web fonts have completely loaded. In this tutorial, we'll look at what we can do to get around the FOUT and have a say in what is shown and when with web font events. All browsers handle the display and loading of web fonts just a little bit differently. Add to that the fact that there are so many different devices and ranges of connection speed, it becomes really tough to ignore the realities of web font loading. Our web fonts can't be used until they load, and we can't be certain how long that will take. So that's where Web Font Loader comes in. Web Font Loader is an open source effort put together between Google and Typekit, and it's a script that gives us some events that we can use to specify what should happen during the various stages of web font loading. Web Font Loader will trigger events when web fonts are loading, when web fonts are active and ready to be used. It will also let us know when web fonts are inactive and effectively can't be loaded at all. And it will let us know all of the above for individual fonts, as well as the fonts overall on our page. Web Font Loader will let us know of these events through classes that are added to our HTML element, or through JavaScript events. We'll only be using the CSS classes in this tutorial, but it's good to know that more advanced options are available if you happen to need them. Let's add the Web Font Loader to our example page to get a feel for how it works. We'll head over to Coda and look at our source code. The first thing we need to do is reference the JavaScript for Web Font Loader. We're using Google Web Fonts, so the setup is quite simple. So to get that script reference, we'll head to the Web Font Loader GitHub page, which is located here, and we'll scroll down to the embed instructions for using Google Web Fonts, which is right here. So these are the script tags we want to use Web Font Loader with Google Fonts. We'll go back to our page and paste this into the head of our document. We'll make a couple of adjustments to make sure it's a valid path to the Web Font Loader JS. And then we'll also make a couple of adjustments to add in the actual font families we're using, because we're not using Droid Sans and Droid Serif. We are using Dosis, Noto Sans, and Noto Serif. We'll save our HTML page there and go check it in the browser to make sure everything's working. So we refresh our page here. And when we inspect the source of our page, you can see that our HTML element has classes indicating that each individual web font has loaded. There's one for Dosis, Noto Sans, and Noto Serif, and then also one class overall that says WF Active, indicating that all our web fonts have loaded. So we know the Web Font Loader script is working. Just to see what happens, let's change our script to look for a font that doesn't actually exist. Let's add one more to our list. We'll call it Not a Font. If we save this and preview in our browser again, you'll notice that not a font is trying to load here in our class list. And then after a certain amount of time, approximately 5 seconds currently, it's going to tell us that, hey, not a font, I couldn't find it, so it's inactive. So that gives you a feel for how the web font loader works. It works at a very granular level, giving you information on each individual font that you're trying to load, as well as the fonts overall. And also, there is a set point at which it will time out. If it can't find your font after a certain amount of time, at this point about 5 seconds, it's just going to give up and say it's inactive. And that's actually quite useful because you don't want to wait forever for a font to load if it's not going to load. I'll take out our fake demonstration font, and now we can do a little bit more with these web font events. Let's go to our CSS and add some styles to use those web font loader classes. The font we're using here is Dosis. It has rounded, narrow letter forms, and our fallback font is Arial Narrow, which is a much more square font, and it sets just a little bit wider than Dosis. If we temporarily change our font stack and remove Dosis, we can see what this will look like. We'll save our CSS with Dosis removed, refresh our page in Chrome, and you can see this is what it looks like with Arial Narrow. Pretty different, a bit wider, much more square. We can't do much about the fact that it's more square because there really are no rounded default device fonts, but we can do something about how wide it is. Let's go back to our CSS, put Dosis back so we don't forget, and we'll add a class that will actually change the appearance of Arial Narrow while we're waiting for Dosis to load. We can do this by adding a rule for our H1 when our HTML element has the class of WF loading. So this rule will apply to any H1s within an HTML element that has a class of WF loading, which is exactly what we want. We'll change our letter spacing to -1 pixel. So this means while the web fonts are loading and we're seeing Arial Narrow instead of Dosis, we'll just squish those letters in just a bit. That way, when our web fonts are ready and Arial Narrow gets swapped out for Dosis, the change in width will be a little bit less jarring. So we can save this and preview our page, but chances are we won't see too much, because right now we're on a really fast connection, and that split second it takes for our web fonts to load isn't really giving us much chance to see the change. If we were on a slower connection, we could definitely see it. For this particular headline, that's probably the most we can do. As I said, there are no default system fonts that are rounded like the web font we've chosen, so Arial Narrow is pretty much as close as we can get, despite it not really being that close. Since our lead-in paragraph is also set in Dosis, let's make the same change there as well. So we'll apply this rule to WF loading epsilon as well, because that's the class that our lead-in paragraph is using. And now with this in place, we'll have a little bit less of a jarring change between our fallback font showing while our web fonts are loading and when our web fonts are ready to display. Even from this small example, you can see that Web Font Loader can be very useful for minimizing layout changes while your web fonts are loading. It also gives you control over what happens if your web fonts aren't able to load at all for some reason. And that's definitely something that could happen. If someone's on a slow connection or if a web server goes down, your fonts might just not be there. For more details on Web Font Loader, as well as the more advanced options that we didn't get a chance to look at, check it out on GitHub. They have really great documentation explaining all the functionality and all the events, as well as the most up-to-date code.